we are talking a lot about how to apply open source practices internally, but when it comes to like quantifying values of any kind for like organizations who maybe never thought of actually contributing back and really looking into a more involved open source journey, do you think that those practices that are coming from InnerSource and those internal conversations could be applied to open source? I mean, when we actually talk about, open sourcing a project or getting involved in an open source project.
I think it's interesting. I think there are some. See. I don't think that these methods or practices are even well established in the inner source world. Whereas there are some organizations who are experimenting with that idea of quantifying the value, I wouldn't say they're the majority. The majority of organizations are still at the same kind of place, maybe, that some of the open source value is being expressed. So they would be doing things like surveys to actually get perceived value. Do developer satisfaction? They would be looking at this kind of qualitative data to try and show some of the value, because it is so hard to be able to accurately quantify that. And there have been, I suppose, the more recent reports in the open source world around looking at the economic value of software reuse. I know some of that was being, presented in Brussels around, in last February, where there were some of the new reports out by Frank Nagel and some of those researchers who are actually looking at this idea of like actually quantifying value. I think the challenge, though, is that, in many respects, certainly in the open source world, um, there will always be the question of value to whom. Even if you can quantify the value of software that you've created in terms of its reuse elsewhere, that might be a different conversation internally than it would be externally. So if you use the same methods to quantify reuse internally in an organization, all the value of that reuse goes back into the organization. Whereas if you take that same value external to the organization, it's not necessarily the case. Now, then you start moving into, well, what's the value of contributions back? But that's a different conversation, right? That's a different model in the open source ecosystem. So I think all of these patterns are incredibly interesting. I don't think we're, as an ecosystem, we're as mature as we might be in either the inner source world or the open source world to start being able to, get down to a bottom line number. But I do think, I think it would be wrong to dismiss the qualitative feedback that we're getting for both the inner source movement and the open source movement in terms of what it's proven to do in terms of, for example, the perception of increased speed, productivity. And again, really hard to manage these things, right? But if developers are consistently saying, I think it makes us faster, I really like the networking opportunities and relationship building that we do, it helps me learn faster, it helps me, scratch my own itch, and that makes me happier in my work. Like, we cannot dismiss that level of value either. And I think sometimes in the rush to do these economic model things, like we kind of pull away from this incredibly valuable feedback. I mean, there's not many things in the world that you can pull a lever and go, ooh, knowledge has increased. Ooh, developer satisfaction has increased. We don't have many of those levers in the tech industry. We do in the inner source and open source world. And so even as we're talking about value, I'd be thinking, well, maybe we need to start thinking, well, do we need to put all our focus on this kind of bottom line value number in order to justify budgets? Or do we need to get organizations thinking more about, how do I create more agile software development teams? How do I increase developer satisfaction? How do I reduce staff turnover? How do I increase staff mobility? Like, these are all the things that they say they want. So if we get to a point where we can draw correlations between both open source and inner source contributions, and those sort of factors, it might be even more valuable to organizations than having some sort of bottom line to say, well, I can buy it over here or I can pay the money over here. And then you're like, well, you're still in a kind of a either or situation, but there's all this other value in the open source and inner source worlds.
I totally agree. And it kind of sounds like that maybe we should actually talk about these things a little bit more in both contexts, because I'm a person who always wants the qualitative data as well. the surveys, the experience, the actual feedback in terms of, is this actually working? However, the other side of conversations that we've been having, both on this podcast and just in general in the ecosystem, is just the usual struggle of, how do I convince anybody in my organization that we should go and contribute to this open source project XYZ that we usually already use or care about because it looks interesting and we should probably use it. And if you're a user, either from a vendor company or an operator, then it just becomes kind of somewhere in the organizational ladder, someone will at some point think about, maybe we should actually do this in the open source community as opposed to internally because of all the maintenance cost, for instance, the risks of not contributing something back that's in the middle of the open source project, and those kind of questions. But I don't really see an equation that's flying around that, hey, put this here, this there, and then you get this, and then you have some ideas. So it all boils down to beliefs and becomes sometimes an almost religious conversation in my experience in terms of, why we should actually contribute back.